Michael Calloway was 41 years old, and he had spent every single one of those years believing that the most dangerous thing a man could do was build his life on something he had not personally tested. He tested everything. That was his nature. Before he signed a contract, he read it 3 times. Before he hired a crew member, he worked beside them for a day. Before he trusted a foundation, he pressed his boot against it himself. That was how he had built Calloway and Reed Construction from 2 men and a borrowed pickup truck into a 17-person firm handling commercial developments across 4 Atlanta counties. Not by trusting blindly, by verifying quietly and moving forward only when the ground beneath him was solid. It was, perhaps, the great irony of his life that the one thing he had never thought to verify was his own marriage. He was not careless about it. He was present, attentive, and consistent in the way that certain men are consistent. Not because they are performing devotion, but because devotion is simply part of the structure of who they are, as load-bearing and non-negotiable as anything else they have built. He remembered dates. He cooked on Thursday evenings. He called his wife from job sites just to hear her voice, even on days when the call lasted 90 seconds and most of those seconds were background noise from whatever she was doing. He brought flowers home on unremarkable Tuesdays because he had read once that the most meaningful gestures were the ones attached to no occasion, and he had believed it completely. His wife, Simone, was 37. She was a regional brand director at Prestige Collective, a luxury lifestyle company with clients whose names appeared in the kind of magazines that sat in waiting rooms of places Michael rarely went. She had been working there for 6 years, had been promoted twice, and carried herself with the particular ease of a woman who knew exactly what she was capable of and had never needed anyone's permission to pursue it. That was one of the things that had drawn Michael to her in the first place, that self-possession, that certainty. They had been together 13 years and married for 9. He had met her at a charity dinner for a youth arts program in Atlanta, an event his mother Vivian had insisted he attend on a Friday night, when he would have chosen blueprints over networking without a second thought. Simone had been one of the event coordinators, moving through the room in a deep burgundy dress with the focused efficiency of someone who had been managing complicated situations since long before anyone gave her the title to do it officially. She had caught Michael staring, and instead of looking away, she had raised one eyebrow, slow and deliberate, as though she had made a private decision about him and was in no rush to share it. He had asked for her number before the evening ended. She had made him wait 3 days before she responded. That had been 13 years ago. Now she traveled 4 to 6 times a year for brand activations and client events. She sat on 2 industry boards. She had friends in social circles that required a level of performance to access that Michael had never particularly wanted and had never pretended to want, which was fine, because Simone moved through those circles with enough grace for both of them. What Michael had not paid close enough attention to, or had perhaps paid attention to and filed under the wrong heading, was the shift in quality that had happened somewhere in the last 18 months. It was not dramatic. It was the kind of shift that happens in degrees so small each individual one is invisible. The way her laughter had begun to sound slightly rehearsed around him, like she was giving him the performance of herself rather than the actual self. The way her eyes when she came home from work were focused somewhere behind him, still occupying a conversation or a space that existed elsewhere. The way her phone, which had once lived on countertops and coffee tables and nightstands without particular ceremony, had gradually moved closer to her body, always face down now, always in her hand when she moved between rooms. He had read all of it as work stress, as the reasonable fatigue of a driven woman managing a demanding career. He had responded, the way he responded to everything, by adjusting, giving her more space, asking fewer depleting questions, making sure the domestic weight of their shared life rested more on his shoulders so hers could carry less. He had believed he was being a good husband. That Thursday morning in late March was entirely unremarkable until it wasn't. Michael was dressed by 7:15, moving through the kitchen with the practiced efficiency of a man whose morning routine had not varied significantly in a decade. Coffee grounds measured, water reservoir filled, button pressed, travel mug retrieved from its hook, sight binder from the shelf in the home office. He kissed Simone on the cheek as she stood at the bathroom mirror pressing mascara to her lashes, and she gave him the half smile she used when she was too focused on something else to fully show up in the moment. "I'll be late tonight," she said, not looking away from the mirror. Board dinner for the Harrington account. I'll leave something in the oven, he said, the way he always said it. He gathered his things. He walked to the front door. And then he stopped, because his reading glasses were still on the nightstand upstairs, which he would need for the materials inspection at the Hargrove Commercial Complex in Buckhead. He went back up, found them, came back down. On the kitchen counter, his phone sat connected to its charging cable. He reached for it, picked it up, and slid it into his pocket without looking at the screen. He was halfway down the front path to his truck when he heard the soft chime of a notification from inside the house. He checked his pocket. The phone he had taken was Simone's. Both were in identical black cases, and he had grabbed the wrong one. He went back in, swapped them, returned his to his pocket. He was down the path again, mug on the hood of the truck, when he remembered the revised site drawings for the Hargrove Drainage Review. They were on the shelf in his home office. He left the mug, went back inside, retrieved the drawings from the office shelf. He was standing at the office doorway, roll of drawings in hand, about to leave, when he heard something that made him go completely still. His phone, sitting on the kitchen counter where he had set it to swap with Simone's, was making a soft sound. It was the sound of an active voice memo. He had been dictating a note to himself about the Hargrove drainage specifications at 6:40 that morning. He had never pressed stop. The memo had been running this entire time, quietly capturing everything in the kitchen. And from the kitchen, he could hear Simone's voice. She was on a call. Her tone was relaxed, easy, the unguarded version of her voice that Michael had once believed was reserved for people she completely trusted. He stood in the doorway of his home office, 4 feet from the kitchen entrance, and he did not move. He did not announce himself. He did not breathe loudly. He stood and he listened, and what he heard began to dismantle, with quiet and terrible efficiency, the architecture of everything he had believed his life to be. The voice on the other end of Simone's call was male, deep-toned, unhurried, and familiar in her name the way that only happens when someone has said your name in private enough times that it stops being a greeting and starts being something else entirely. Something possessive, something settled. Michael did not know his name yet. He would learn it later. That morning he knew only the voice and what the voice was saying and what Simone was saying back, and that was enough. More than enough. He never questions anything, Simone said, with the lightness of someone describing a predictable feature of a landscape they have already decided to leave. I told him tonight was a board dinner, and he said he'd leave food in the oven. A low sound from the other end. Amused. Comfortable. That's Michael, she continued, and the way she said his name. Not cruelly, but with a kind of mild, distant familiarity, the way you'd reference a habit you've outgrown, did something to his chest that he would not find accurate language for until much later. He builds things. He shows up. He's steady. But I have been steady my entire life, and I am done choosing steady over everything else. There was a pause. Then the voice on the other end said something that Michael could not fully make out. And Simone laughed. That particular unguarded laugh. The one that came from a real place. The laugh he had not heard directed at him in longer than he now understood was simply a coincidence of timing. The call continued. Michael stood in the doorway of his office and listened to 4 more minutes of his wife's voice. He heard enough to understand the shape of what he was dealing with. Not every detail, but the outline, which was the only thing he needed to determine the scale of the problem. In construction, you learn that skill quickly. You do not need to see every compromised weld to know a structure is unsound. You learn to read what the surface tells you about what is underneath. What the surface was telling him now was not ambiguous. The recording captured a total of 19 minutes and 31 seconds. The first 11 minutes were his own voice, dictating notes about drainage gradients and concrete specifications in the early quiet of 6:40 that morning. The next 4 minutes and 33 seconds were Simone's phone call. The remaining 3.5 minutes were ambient kitchen sounds. The coffee maker finishing its cycle, the soft close of a cabinet. As she moved further into the house, the call apparently continuing, but no longer within the microphone's range. He stood in the office doorway after the kitchen sounds faded to nothing. He did not move for what felt like a long time. He was not frozen. He was doing something specific and deliberate with that stillness, something he had learned to do on job sites when something went wrong, and the first impulse was to react before understanding. You resist that impulse. You make yourself be still until you can see the actual shape of the whole problem. Because the first thing you feel is almost never the thing you need to act on. The first thing you feel is just shock wearing the mask of an emotion. He walked out of the house. He sat in his truck with the engine idling and his hands resting in his lap, and he did not play the recording back. He had heard it once. Once was sufficient. He navigated to the voice memo app on his phone, confirmed the file had saved automatically to the cloud backup, verified its total duration matched what he had heard, and then put his phone in the cup holder and drove to the Hargrove site. He arrived 7 minutes late. In 11 years of running Calloway and Reed, Michael Calloway had never been late for a site inspection. Not once. His site supervisor Deshawn noted the fact with visible surprise, but the professionalism not to mention it. Michael offered no explanation. He pulled on his work vest, greeted his crew with the usual level of attention, and moved through the first 2 hours of the morning inspection with the surface competence of a man whose hands and professional instincts were so deeply trained they could operate independently of the part of his mind that was currently occupied with something else entirely. The something else it was doing was cataloging 18 months of moments, now newly illuminated by a single 4-minute and 33-second recording. The board dinners that occurred more frequently than any board's meeting schedule could reasonably explain. The weekend in Miami for a brand activation that Simone had returned from with a quality of warmth and ease that Michael had attributed to sun and distance from the daily grind. The phone, always face down on surfaces now, always in her hand when she moved between rooms. The slightly elevated unreachability in her eyes when he reached for her hand in a restaurant or on the couch. The nights she came to bed after he was already asleep and rose before he woke. The small, accumulating texture of a person who was partially present and partially somewhere else, which he had attributed, one instance at a time, across 18 months, to the reasonable exhaustion of a driven woman navigating a demanding career. He had been reading the right signals. He had simply been drawing the wrong map. That evening he came home to find dinner already handled. Takeout containers arranged neatly on the counter. Simone sitting at the kitchen table scrolling her phone with her shoes off and her hair down. The decompressed version of herself that appeared when the professional day was fully over. She looked up when he came in and smiled and asked about the Hargrove inspection. He answered in the steady, even register he used for everything, told her about the drainage corrections, mentioned that the city inspector was scheduled for the following Thursday, asked how her day had gone. She told him. The story was fluent and detailed and naturally paced, the way her stories always were. She was a gifted storyteller, always had been. One of the first things that had drawn him in, 13 years ago. Later, when she came to bed with a headache, he brought water and 2 aspirin upstairs without being asked, the way he had done dozens of times before. She looked up at him as he set the glass on her nightstand, and something moved behind her eyes for just a second, something that was neither gratitude nor guilt, but contained the suggestion of both. Before her expression settled into the easier, surface warmth she wore with him most often now. "Thank you, baby," she said. "Of course," he said. He went back downstairs. He sat at the kitchen table in the dark for a long time, lights off, the only illumination the ambient glow from the streetlight through the curtains. He was not thinking dramatically. He was thinking precisely, the way he thought through every significant problem, identifying what he knew, what he needed to know, what the first correct move looked like. Then he took out his phone and called his older brother Terrence. Terrence Calloway was 46, a former DeKalb County detective who had left the department after 15 years and now ran a private security and investigations consultancy out of an office in Decatur. He was the sharper of the 2 brothers without being the warmer one, and Michael had always understood that difference clearly enough to know which quality he needed and precisely when to reach for it. Terrence answered on the second ring. He heard the particular texture of his brother's silence and did not waste either of their time with unnecessary questions. "Tell me what you need," Terrence said. "Everything there is to know about a situation," Michael said. "How long would that take?" Terrence was quiet for 3 full seconds, which Michael recognized as his brother calculating rather than hesitating. "Give me 10 days. You'll have it in installments, so you understand it as it builds rather than all at once." "I want all of it," Michael said. "Whatever there is. Don't soften it." "You'll have it," Terrence said. Then, after a pause, "Get some sleep if you can." Michael did not sleep much that night. But before the morning came, he had made the first of several decisions that would shape everything that followed. Grief was real, and it was present, and it would have its full season in time. But grief would not be the thing that drove what happened next. He had work to do, and he had always done his best work from clarity rather than from feeling. He would do it the only way he knew, precisely, patiently, and without a single step wasted. Terrence's first report arrived on a Tuesday evening, delivered by secure message at 9:47, while Simone was watching a show in the living room and Michael sat at the kitchen table with his laptop open to what he had told her were project cost estimates. The house was quiet enough that he could hear the faint sound of her program through the wall, the low background hum of a normal evening that now felt like scenery in a play he had not known he was performing in. The man on the recording had a name now. Garrison Wells, 39 years old, director of brand partnerships at a media company whose Atlanta headquarters were 4 blocks from Prestige Collective's Midtown offices. He and Simone had met 18 months ago at an industry networking mixer at a rooftop venue on Peachtree, one of those curated professional events where everyone was selling something, most of it subtle. He was tall and well-dressed in the particular way of men who did not grow up with money but had spent a decade carefully constructing the surface language of a man who always had. He drove a leased car that outpaced his verifiable salary. He maintained a social media presence that projected both success and an approachability designed to make ambition look effortless. He was, the report noted with the clean economy of Terrence's professional voice, currently in a long-term relationship with a woman named Patrice who worked in pharmaceutical sales and, by all available evidence, believed herself to be the only woman in the picture. Michael read the first report twice from beginning to end. Then he closed his laptop and went to bed. He lay in the dark beside Simone, whose breathing was deep and even and entirely untroubled, and he looked at the ceiling for a long time. He was not thinking about her with anger. He was thinking about time, about the specific architecture of the past 14 months, which Garrison Wells had apparently occupied with a regularity and intentionality that Michael was only now beginning to comprehend. He was thinking about how a parallel life requires daily, active maintenance, how you have to be deliberate every single morning about what you show one person and what you give to another, and how that level of sustained deliberateness is not an accident. It is a choice, made repeatedly, with clear eyes. He finally slept somewhere past 2 in the morning. The second report arrived 4 days later and was considerably harder to receive. It documented contact between Garrison and Simone across 14 months with the clinical thoroughness that Terrence brought to everything. The call logs were consistent and frequent, sometimes twice daily, most often during Michael's confirmed working hours, occasionally in the late evening on nights when Simone had told Michael she was catching up on client emails. The message record, obtained through methods Terrence did not elaborate on and Michael did not ask him to explain, built a picture that left no room for the kind of reassuring alternative interpretation a man in Michael's position might be tempted to reach for. This was not confusion. It was not a moment of weakness that had extended longer than intended. It was a relationship, full, intimate, deliberately maintained, that Simone had been running alongside their marriage for over a year with what the evidence suggested was a level of ease and comfort that would have been impossible to achieve without significant practice. There had been 4 overnight hotel stays, 2 in Atlanta, 1 in Charlotte during the brand conference Simone had attended in October, from which she had returned showing Michael photographs of the convention center lobby and mentioning the group dinner with colleagues in the way she always mentioned work events, casually, with just enough detail to make the story feel real. 1 in Nashville, the weekend she had told Michael that her college friend Janelle was going through something personal and needed her physically close. Michael had sent flowers that weekend, a small arrangement for Janelle with a handwritten card. Thinking of you. Hope things look brighter soon. Simone had called him that evening, slightly breathless, and thanked him. Said Janelle was moved to tears. He sat with that detail for a long time after reading it. Set the phone down, looked at the window, picked it up, and continued. The third report arrived on a Thursday evening, 9 days after his call to Terrence, and it was the one that shifted the emotional temperature of everything, from grief, which is something that happens to you, to something deliberate and purposeful and cold, which is something you choose. 3 months ago, in January, Simone had attended a private 90-minute consultation with a family law attorney named Renata Chambers at a boutique firm in Midtown Atlanta. Terrence had confirmed through a professional contact that the stated and recorded purpose of that consultation was an initial assessment of asset distribution in a potential marital dissolution. Specifically, Simone had asked for an evaluation of how a Georgia family court would classify and calculate the value of Calloway and Reed Construction as a distributable marital asset. The business Michael had co-founded, had built from one small contract into something that employed 20 people and served 4 counties. He read that paragraph 3 times. He put the phone down on the table and looked up at the light fixture above him. The pendant he had wired in himself 8 years ago when they moved into this house. The one Simone had selected from a design catalog and pointed to and said was exactly the right thing for the space, and which he had spent a Sunday afternoon installing because she had wanted it. He thought about that afternoon. The pizza they had ordered because neither of them had bothered to cook. Simone sitting on the counter, swinging her feet, watching him work with the wire stripper and the junction box. "I love watching you build things," she had said. "You always know exactly what you're doing." He had looked up from the fixture and felt, in that moment, the specific and unqualified contentment of a man who believed he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He closed his laptop. He sat at the table in the quiet kitchen for a long time. Not paralyzed. Thinking. Mapping the distance between what had existed and what he now understood existed, and calculating what the gap required of him. Then he pulled out his phone and composed a message to Patricia Holt, the attorney who had handled Calloway and Reed's incorporation and contract work for 8 years. She was meticulous in a way that bordered on architectural. She communicated in documented facts and did not believe in unnecessary words. He wrote, "Patricia, I need to meet regarding a personal matter. It is urgent. I am available at your earliest opening." She responded within 35 minutes. "Tomorrow, 7:30. My office." He drove there the next morning directly from a pre-dawn site check, arriving in his work clothes without having considered changing them, and laid everything across her conference table. She listened without interrupting, her pen moving at intervals, her eyes on him rather than her notepad because she was the kind of attorney who watched the person more than the notes. When he finished, she asked a single question. "How much time do we need to do this correctly?" "As much as it takes," Michael said. "Then we begin this morning," she said, and reached for her legal pad. Michael Calloway was not a man who performed. He was direct. He was transparent. He was the man who told you plainly what a job would cost, and what it would take and how long it would require. Because in his experience, one honest and uncomfortable conversation early was always less damaging than the comfortable avoidance that made it worse. He had run his business that way. He had conducted his friendships that way. He had tried to conduct his marriage that way, which was, he now understood, one of the reasons he had been so easy to deceive. He had extended to Simone the same good faith he asked others to extend to him, and she had accepted it and built her plan inside it. Now he built something of his own inside her assumptions about him. He gave her 6 weeks of the most quietly attentive version of himself that she had seen in 2 years. Not excessive, not performed, not bright enough to register as unusual. Just present, engaged. The man she had fallen in love with before the business grew large and the years added their weight. He cooked Thursday dinners again, which had been their tradition in the early years and had slowly dissolved under the pressure of full schedules. He suggested revisiting the jazz restaurant in Virginia Highland where they had gone on their second date, and they went one Saturday in April, and Simone wore a green dress he had always loved and laughed at his stories the way she used to, and Michael sat across from her and allowed himself, briefly, to feel the full weight of what was being lost, because it had been real once. That mattered, even now. He did not allow that grief to interfere with the work happening beneath the surface. Patricia moved methodically through the legal architecture required to protect Calloway and Reed. Every step she took was entirely within the law, documented, defensible, and precisely designed to ensure that any future valuation of the business in divorce proceedings would reflect a structure that Simone's January consultation with Renata Chambers had not anticipated. Derek Reed, Michael's co-founder and oldest friend, was brought into the necessary portions of the process and responded with the quiet, contained fury of a man who had watched Michael build something from absolute zero and was not going to watch it be dismantled from the outside. "Whatever you need," Derek said, on the phone one evening, his voice low and steady. "Whatever it takes. You know that." "I know," Michael said. "Thank you." Terrence's documentation continued. 14 more documented interactions between Garrison and Simone across those 6 weeks. The pattern of Tuesday and Thursday contact had expanded to include occasional Wednesday evenings, coinciding neatly with the working late and board dinners and friend commitments that Simone reported to Michael in the same casual, comfortable tone she used for everything. Michael received every update, filed every detail, then went back to whatever room Simone was in and continued being the husband she believed she had comprehensively figured out. There were moments that tested him in ways he had not prepared for. One Sunday afternoon, he came home to find her sitting on the living room floor, legs crossed, an old photograph album open across her knees. She looked up when he came through the door, and before she arranged her expression into anything deliberate, he caught something raw and unguarded in her eyes, something that looked, with devastating sincerity, like sorrow. "I was looking at the Savannah pictures," she said. Michael stopped in the doorway. He remembered Savannah, their 5th anniversary, a small inn with deep wooden floors and tall windows, a waterfront restaurant where they had stayed at the table for 3 hours after the food was finished, talking in the unhurried way of people who are genuinely interested in each other and in no rush to get back to the rest of the world. He sat down beside her on the floor. They looked at the photographs together. Simone tucked her feet beneath her and leaned slightly toward him, and said, in a voice that was entirely unperformed, "We were so happy then, Michael." He looked at the photographs. He thought about the inn and the restaurant and the drive back up I-16 in the early morning, her feet on the dashboard, both of them singing to a playlist she had made. He thought about how real it had all been. "That was a great trip," he said quietly. She nodded and turned the page. That night he slept better than he had in weeks. Not because he had set the grief aside, but because he had accepted it fully. Grief and purpose were not opposites. You could carry both. You simply had to make sure purpose was the one driving. The social dimension of Simone's strategy revealed itself during the 5th week, in fragments that Michael assembled across several gatherings with their shared circle of friends. At a dinner party at the Reed's house, he heard Simone in the kitchen with Yvonne Reed, her voice carrying the specific register of a woman confiding something painful, but not too painful. "Sometimes I feel like I'm standing right next to him, and he's somewhere else entirely," she said. "Like the work is the marriage, and I'm just what's there when the work stops." At a weekend barbecue at the Calloways, he caught a fragment of a conversation between Simone and their neighbor Camille, Simone's hand on Camille's arm, her eyes soft and earnest. "I've tried to tell him," she said. "I just don't think he hears me the way he hears a job site." He watched this pattern across 5 separate social occasions. She was building her exit narrative, constructing, brick by quiet brick, the version of their marriage that would make sense to people after she left it. The distant, work-consumed husband. The lonely, loyal wife who had tried everything. The woman who had no choice but to find herself elsewhere. Michael sat at those tables and smiled at the right moments and asked about people's children and topped up wine glasses and said absolutely nothing. Because every word Simone spoke into those rooms was landing in soil that had known Michael Calloway for years, that already knew the weight of his integrity, that had seen him show up for these same people in concrete, unglamorous ways that outlasted any narrative anyone could build. He understood, with the particular clarity that comes from seeing a structure clearly rather than from inside it, that Simone had fundamentally misread the room she thought she had spent years cultivating. She had been preparing the ground for sympathy. What she had not accounted for was that the ground already knew him better than she knew it did. Vivian Calloway's house in College Park had not changed in any meaningful way since Michael was 14 years old, and this kitchen was the center of the known world. Same low ceilings with the overhead light that buzzed faintly if the bulb was not seated correctly. Same worn linoleum that Vivian refused to replace on the grounds that it had never given her a single problem, and she did not understand the logic of replacing things that worked. Same smell of something slow cooking on the stove regardless of the hour or season, because Vivian Calloway did not believe in a kitchen that was not producing something. Same table with the same 4 chairs, the same afternoon light through the window above the sink that Michael had been looking at since childhood and had always associated with a particular quality of safety he had not found with the same reliability anywhere else. He pulled into the narrow driveway behind Terrence's dark sedan on a Sunday in the 4th week and sat behind the wheel for a moment before going in. Not because he needed to gather himself, because he wanted to be present for this conversation in the way that it deserved. Fully arrived, not still carrying the momentum of the drive. Inside, Terrence was at the table with his coffee mug and the particular contained expression he wore when he was holding significant information and waiting for the correct moment to deliver it. The professional patience of a man who had spent 15 years in rooms where timing mattered. Vivian was at the stove with her back to the door, moving through the familiar economy of motion that came from 40 years of feeding people through both ordinary days and extraordinary ones. She set a pan of cornbread on its trivet on the counter without turning around. "Sit down," she said. "Coffee is fresh. I made enough for all of us." Michael poured his cup and took the chair he had occupied at this table since he was old enough to sit in it without assistance. There was something that he could only call steadying about that. The particular reliability of a chair in a kitchen that had not changed. In a week when almost everything else he had counted on was revealing itself to have been built on ground he had not tested. Vivian dried her hands on a dish towel, poured her own coffee, and sat directly across from him. She folded her hands on the table. She looked at him the way she had always looked at him when something serious needed to be said, with the full weight of her attention and without the slightest softening of her focus. "Tell me," she said. He had rehearsed the shape of it on the drive over. But sitting here with her eyes on him, eyes that had watched him move from a quiet, serious boy into a quiet, serious man over more than 3 decades. The rehearsal dissolved, and he simply spoke. He started at the beginning. The recording. Standing in the doorway of his office, 4 feet from the kitchen, hearing his wife's voice carrying in the still morning air. The 4 minutes and 33 seconds that had rearranged everything he thought he understood about his own life. He spoke without dramatizing it because it did not require dramatizing. It was already as heavy as it was. Adding anything to it would not make it more true, only more performed. He moved through Terrence's findings in the order they had arrived. The 14 months. The 4 hotel stays. The daily calls during work hours. The intimate correspondence. He described the Nashville weekend, the one where he had sent flowers for Janelle's supposed personal crisis, and paused for a moment because that particular detail still had a texture that the others did not. When he reached the January consultation with Renata Chambers, Vivian's hands tightened fractionally around her coffee cup. It was the only visible physical response she made across the entire telling. She did not interrupt. She did not ask questions. She let him speak everything that needed to be spoken, and she held the space around it without trying to fill it. The silence after he finished had the particular quality of something that has been fully heard. Terrence refilled his own cup. The refrigerator hummed its steady note. A car moved past on the street outside, unhurried. Then Vivian spoke. Her voice had the density of a woman who had never confused love with the willingness to look away from a hard thing. "She was sitting at this table," she said. 3 Sundays ago. I put food in front of her. I spoke to her. She sat in this house." She paused. "In my house." "I know," Michael said. Vivian looked at him for a long, still moment. The kind of look that is also a measure. "What do you need from me?" "Nothing different from what you're already doing," Michael said. "When you see her, don't change. Don't let her see anything in you that tells her something has shifted." "Not yet." Vivian nodded. "Once. The finality of it." She stood and cut the cornbread into even squares and set a piece in front of each of them. She sat back down and told them about Devontae, Terrence's oldest, who had just received his acceptance letter from Georgia Tech's architecture program. She delivered the news with the particular emphasis that mothers use when they need their children to understand that the information carries a meaning beyond the information itself. A reminder of continuity, of what persists, of the long, unbroken line of a family that keeps building things regardless of what arrives to interrupt it. Michael heard what she intended. He let it settle into him the way you let solid ground settle under your boots after uncertain terrain. They finished their cornbread. Terrence mentioned a restoration project he was considering for an old car he had bought at an estate sale in Macon. Vivian told them the church had finally resolved the long-running dispute about the sanctuary renovations, which she characterized as a minor miracle of institutional patience. The conversation moved easily in the way that the conversations of people who know each other across decades can move, touching the ordinary and the serious without drama, without needing to make the weight of one thing cancel out the warmth of another. On the drive back that evening, Michael passed through the corridor of the city where he had landed his first major commercial contract 11 years ago. A parking structure on a block that had since been redeveloped around it, but the structure itself still standing, solid and unchanged. He had driven the first anchor bolt himself on that job. He remembered the morning, the particular quality of the light, the empty site, the way beginning something real from nothing felt like a kind of conversation with his own future. He had built that with his hands. He had built all of it with his hands. And there was not a single thing that had happened in the past 4 weeks. Not the recording, not the reports, not any of the 14 months of evidence that Terrence had assembled with his characteristic quiet precision. That changed what those hands were capable of producing going forward. He drove home through the Sunday evening dark. He made tea. He sat at the kitchen table with his legal notepad and his phone and his laptop, and he worked through the numbers and the logistics and the sequence of what needed to happen next for 2 hours, until everything was mapped clearly enough that he trusted it. Then he put it all away and went to bed. He slept better than he had in 3 weeks. Michael made the meal he had cooked on their first anniversary. Blackened salmon, roasted sweet potatoes with garlic and thyme, a cucumber and red onion salad dressed with the light vinegar dressing his mother had taught him at 16 and that he had never deviated from because it was already exactly right. And the same bottle of Riesling, the specific label from a small Georgia vineyard that he and Simone had shared in their first apartment, on a second-hand couch, with candles stuck in old wine bottles because they didn't yet own proper candlesticks and neither of them had cared. He set the table with the good plates. The cloth napkins Simone had bought at a market in Charleston 2 summers ago. The wine glasses that usually stayed in the cabinet for guests. He worked through the preparation in the quiet kitchen, and there was something in the rhythm of it, the particular sensory language of a meal he had made with intention, that required no performance. He was not pretending. He was honoring what had once been real by being fully present in one final act of it. Simone came through the front door at 6:42 and stopped in the kitchen doorway. She took in the table, the food, the wine breathing on the counter, her husband at the stove moving through the familiar motions. Something crossed her face that was not quite recognition and not quite guilt and not quite tenderness, but contained elements of all three, the compound expression of a person standing in the presence of something they are in the process of choosing to leave. "Michael," she said, "what is all this?" "Sit down," he said, almost ready. She changed out of her work clothes and returned in a soft knit shirt and jeans, the uncurated version of herself that he had always preferred. She poured wine for both of them and settled at the table and watched him plate the food with the same unhurried attention she had given him in the early years, when watching each other do ordinary things was still a form of intimacy, so new it felt remarkable. They ate. The food was very good. The salmon had the exact crust it needed. The sweet potatoes were soft and caramelized at the edges in a way that took patience to achieve. Simone took a second serving of the salad without asking, which was the thing she always did when she loved a meal and was too comfortable to be self-conscious about it. They talked. She told him about a campaign client who communicated exclusively in abstract metaphors and could not be pinned down to an actual decision. He told her about a city inspector who had shown up to the Moorfield site 2 hours early and found 3 things to document that he would not have noticed if he had arrived on time. They both laughed at stories that were genuinely funny, and the laughter was real, even though Michael was carrying something behind it that she could not see. That was the strangest part, not the performance. The fact that beneath the performance there were still real things. Moments that were genuine. A kind of affection that had not fully died even in the face of what he knew. He had not expected that. He had thought knowing the truth would simplify the emotion. Instead, it had revealed how layered and complicated a 13-year love could be, even one that was ending. In a quiet space between one topic and the next, Michael set his fork down gently. "Can I ask you something?" he said. His voice was exactly what it had been all evening. "Of course," she said. "Is there anything you want to tell me? About where we actually are? About how things honestly feel for you?" The change in Simone's face was very small and moved very fast. A brief stillness, like the moment before a structure settles under a new load, and then it resolved into something warm and practiced and perfectly assembled. She reached across the table. She laid her hand over his. "Baby," she said, and her voice was full of something that an unknowing person would have read as complete sincerity. "I have been thinking lately about how grateful I am. For you. For what we've built. I know I've been distracted. Work has been a lot, but I want you to know that I see you. I see how hard you work, how you never stop taking care of things. She squeezed his hand gently, looking at him with soft and open eyes. I'm good, Michael. We're good. I'm really grateful for this life. She offered every word in her considerable and well-practiced arsenal. Every word except the one true one. Michael looked at her hand over his. He turned his palm up and held her hand for a moment. One full, unhurried moment. And then he released it gently and picked up his fork. Tell me more about this client, he said. The one with the metaphors. She laughed and launched into the story again, and he listened with genuine attention, because it was a genuinely funny story, and because he had 2 more hours to give her, and he was going to give them fully. They finished dinner. They moved to the couch and watched a film they had both been meaning to see for months, and Simone was asleep against his shoulder before the last act, her breathing going slow and deep the way it always had in sleep, that particular evenness that he had always found peaceful to listen to. Michael sat with the film going unwatched until her breathing was deeply settled. Then he carefully shifted out from under her, covered her with the throw blanket from the couch arm, turned off the television, and went out to his truck. He sat in the dark driveway for a long time. The neighborhood was still. The streetlights made long shapes across the road. He was not crying. That particular door had been sealed over the past weeks, not against grief, but against the kind of grief that required an audience. The grief was real, and it was his, and it would have its season in time. Tonight was not that season. He went back inside when the night air grew cold. He did not return to the bedroom. He took a blanket from the hall closet and went to the guest room, and he set his alarm for the usual early hour, and he slept. In the morning, he was gone before she woke. He had, in the truest sense of the phrase, already left. Michael arrived at the Moorfield mixed-use development site at 6:58. Which was 4 minutes earlier than his standard arrival, because he had not been able to remain in bed past 5:15 and had decided to use the additional morning rather than lie in the dark waiting for an alarm that was going to sound regardless. He walked the perimeter alone in the gray early light, coffee in one hand, his site notes in the other, checking the overnight work and noting 2 small corrections on the drainage form that would need to be addressed before the concrete crew arrived at 8. This was the part of the work he had always loved most, and that love had not diminished by a single degree across 11 years. The pre-dawn stillness of an active site before the day committed itself to motion. The particular quality of presence it required. To look at a space and let it tell you what it needed. To read a problem before it became a failure. That was, he had long understood, not just a professional skill. It was the deepest expression of who he was. His crew arrived at 7:15 in their trucks. Coffee in travel mugs, gear in the truck beds, the easy morning rhythm of men who know their work and arrive ready for it. Michael ran the briefing at the tailgate of his truck the way he always ran it, specific about the day's sequencing, clear about the standards he expected, direct with the 2 newer crew members about 3 adjustments he needed from them based on what he had observed in the previous afternoon's work. No excess, no performance, just the information needed to start the day correctly. Deshawn, his site supervisor, fell into step beside him as the crew dispersed toward their stations, and they moved together toward the east section for the morning framing review. You seem settled today, Deshawn said, in the careful sideways manner that people who work closely with someone develop for noting things without transforming them into conversations that weren't invited. Good morning for it, Michael said. Deshawn smiled and let it go. At 9 o'clock exactly, Patricia Holt filed the petition at the Fulton County Courthouse. At 9:22, a process server arrived at the house on Birchwood Lane and rang the doorbell. Michael was on a scissor lift 35 feet up, reviewing a steel connection point on the north wall with Calvin, his lead framing supervisor, when his phone vibrated against his hip. He noted the time. He completed the inspection point he was in the middle of, made his notation, and climbed down. He stepped away from the lift and the active area, and he checked his screen. A text from an unknown number, not Simone's registered line, which meant she had found another phone or borrowed one, because she had correctly understood that her own number might not be answered right now. Michael, please call me. I need you to call me. Please. He read it once. He put the phone back in his pocket. He walked back to where Calvin was waiting beside the lift, and they resumed the inspection without comment from either of them. His phone vibrated 4 more times in the next 55 minutes. 2 additional texts. 2 calls, the second from her own number, which confirmed she had both options available and was working through them. He let everyone go. Patricia's office was already intercepting the formal channels. Everything else, Michael had decided before this morning even began, would be answered by the particular and complete eloquence of silence. He had been talking plainly and consistently for 13 years. He had nothing left that required saying. The documents had said it now, and they had said it with a precision and completeness that no phone conversation could match or add to. He worked through the morning with the steady focus that had always been his best professional quality. At 10:30, he approved a material delivery from the South Gate. At 11, he walked the interior layout with the general contractor's site manager, who had 2 questions about the mechanical room dimensions that Michael resolved on the spot with a tape measure and a pencil. At 11:45, he signed off on the morning's completed framing sections and sent Deschamps' crew to lunch early because they had earned it. At noon, he drove to the diner on Camp Creek Parkway, where Terrence and Vivian were already in a corner booth. His mother had a slice of peach cobbler in front of her and was studying it with the expression of a food critic compiling a finding that was not going to be flattering. "They changed the topping," she said, as Michael slid into the booth across from her. New ownership decided a crumble was an improvement. She moved the fork slightly and examined the underside of the topping. "It is not an improvement. The coffee is genuinely better, though," Terrence said. He pushed a mug toward Michael. "The coffee was never the concern," Vivian said firmly. "The cobbler was the entire reason." They ordered. Michael had a turkey club on sourdough. Terrence had a patty melt with extra onions. Vivian, having delivered her assessment, ordered a second slice of the cobbler on the grounds that the fruit filling itself remained sound, and she owed it a complete evaluation before rendering a final judgment. Terrence mentioned that Devontae had already mapped out his first-year elective selections for Georgia Tech. Vivian told Michael that his nephew had called her directly to ask which courses she would prioritize, and the quiet pride that moved through her voice when she described that phone call was the particular pride of a woman who had planted something in a child's character years ago and was watching it come up through the soil right on schedule. Michael ate his sandwich. He mentioned Deschamps' certification exam the following month and said he intended to give Deschamps a bonus when he passed, because he would pass. He mentioned the Smyrna office lease discussions, which were moving toward a signing date within the next 2 weeks. He mentioned that Calvin's wife had delivered their second child on Tuesday, and that he had arranged for dinner to be sent to the family 4 times across the first week, which Calvin had not asked for, and which Michael had arranged before Calvin had a chance to. Simone's name did not come up. Not once, not from any of them. There was a specific and important quality to that absence. Not the absence of grief, which was still present in Michael in its proper form, contained and acknowledged and not denied. Rather, the recognition that what this table required today was not grief. It required the presence of people who had chosen each other across the length of their lives and continued to do so without tallying the cost. That was what they offered him, and he accepted it without ceremony, because it was the most useful thing in the world. Vivian paid the check. She had been paying at this particular diner since Michael and Terrence were teenagers, and in the intervening decades she had made it clear, through repetition and mild severity, that this was simply how it was, and she was not interested in discussing alternatives. Michael drove back to the site and worked through the full afternoon. By 5:45 the day's targets were met, the crew was packed out, and the Moorfield site was quiet in the way that well-run sites go quiet at the end of a productive day, satisfied rather than merely finished. He locked the site office, walked to his truck, and sat for a moment with the engine off and the windows down. Then he drove home to his new house, which was clean and quiet and entirely his, and he made himself a simple dinner and ate it at his kitchen table and went to bed at a reasonable hour. He slept without interruption until morning. The conference room on the 19th floor of the building on Marietta Street had a long window that ran the width of the north wall, looking out over downtown Atlanta the way a painting in a museum looks out over the room that contains it. Beautiful, unmoving, and entirely indifferent to whatever is happening at the human level below it. The city was doing what it always did on a Wednesday morning in October. Moving, building, tearing down, rebuilding, in the particular productive noise of a place that does not stop to witness private matters. Michael arrived at 9:42. He had come directly from a pre-dawn framing walkthrough at the Moorfield site, and he was in his work clothes. The dark canvas shirt with the Calloway and Reed logo at the chest, the worn work pants, the boots that had been on more job sites than he could number. He had considered changing on the drive over. He had a clean shirt and a jacket in the back seat, which he always kept there for unexpected client meetings. He had decided against it before he reached the parking deck. He had not created this situation. He was not going to dress for it as though he had. He would sit in that room as exactly the man he was, wearing exactly what he wore when he was doing the work of his life, because that was the most honest thing he could offer, and honesty had been his policy since the beginning, which was more than he could say for everyone involved. Patricia was already in the conference room when he arrived. Her folder centered on the table in front of her the way she centered everything, with the precision of a woman who had been building legal cases for 20 years and understood that even small presentations of order carried weight. She glanced at his clothes when he entered, and her expression said nothing, which meant she approved, because Patricia Holt's face communicated very clearly when she did not approve of something. He sat to her right. He poured water from the carafe. He looked out the window at the city and thought about nothing specific. Just let the morning be what it was for the few minutes before it became something else. At 10 o'clock precisely, the conference room door opened. Simone entered first. She was wearing the charcoal blazer that Michael recognized from the wardrobe she reserved for high-stakes professional situations, the one she called her armor, once, years ago, in the way couples sometimes named the private language of each other's habits. Her hair was immaculate. Her posture was composed in the particular way of someone who has rehearsed the composition and is now maintaining it through deliberate effort rather than natural ease. You could see it, if you knew what natural ease looked like on her body, which Michael did. The composure was constructed. The effort underneath it was real. She looked at Michael for less than a full second when she entered. In that fraction of time, before she moved her eyes to the table between them, he saw what was in them. Not the practiced warmth she had worn through all the dinners and social gatherings of the past 6 weeks. Not the careful openness she had deployed when he asked her, over the last dinner, if there was anything she wanted to tell him. Something older than any of that. Something that belonged to a person arriving at a destination they had convinced themselves they had mapped accurately and discovering, in real time, that the map was wrong. Behind her came Vanessa Briggs, her attorney, compact, sharp-featured, in a slate-gray suit that said she was here to work and had done this many times before. She assessed the room in the 2 seconds it took her to cross the threshold and had already arrived at 3 working evaluations before she set her portfolio on the table and sat down. Patricia opened the folder. "Thank you for making time," she said, in the tone she used for everything. Informational, unhurried, requiring no dramatic flourish because the material did not require one. "I'll begin with the documentation we've compiled. Exhibit A is a voice recording obtained on March 22nd at 7:41 in the morning on Mr. Calloway's personal device. The recording is 19 minutes and 31 seconds in total. The relevant portion, 4 minutes and 33 seconds, captures a phone conversation between Mrs. Calloway and a Mr. Garrison Wells. The recording was unintentional. Mr. Calloway did not initiate it deliberately." Vanessa Briggs wrote rapidly. Simone's hands remained still in her lap. Exhibit B contains a timeline of contact between Mrs. Calloway and Mr. Wells spanning 14 months, compiled from confirmed call logs and corroborating digital records. The contact is regular, frequent, and consistent with an ongoing personal relationship extending well beyond a professional acquaintance. Patricia set the page down. She picked up the next one. Exhibit C documents 4 overnight hotel stays during dates that Mrs. Calloway had described to Mr. Calloway as professional events or visits to friends. At this, Vanessa touched Simone's arm briefly. Simone shook her head, a tight, small movement. Exhibit D is a record confirming that on January 14th of this year, Mrs. Calloway attended a 90-minute consultation with attorney Renata Chambers at Chambers and Folsom Family Law. The stated and recorded purpose of the consultation was an evaluation of property division in a potential marital dissolution. Mrs. Calloway specifically requested an assessment of the market value of Calloway and Reed Construction. Mr. Calloway was not informed of this meeting before, during, or after it took place. The room was quiet enough that the climate control hum was audible. Finally, Patricia picked up the last section without adjusting her pace. Our records document 17 transfers from the joint savings account between Mrs. Calloway and Mr. Calloway, executed across a 9-month period and totaling $19,400. The transfer amounts were irregular, ranging between $415 and $1,400, at intervals that appeared deliberately designed to avoid establishing a visible pattern. These funds were transferred to a personal savings account opened by Mrs. Calloway at Atlantic Community Credit Union, an institution with which she had no prior banking history. The silence after Patricia set the final page down was the kind that has a specific weight. Outside the window, Atlanta continued moving 20 stories below, entirely unaware of what was being concluded in this room. Vanessa Briggs leaned toward Simone and said something low and urgent. Simone did not respond to her attorney. She was looking at the center of the table, her jaw set, her composure holding but visibly requiring effort to do so. Then slowly, with the quality of someone making a deliberate decision rather than a reactive one, she raised her eyes. She looked at Michael directly, fully, for the first time since entering the room. And what was in that look was not what he had expected. He had expected performance. The kind she had deployed at dinner, the kind she had been deploying in social rooms for months. What he got instead was something unguarded and final. The expression of a person who has just understood, completely and too late, the gap between who they thought they were dealing with and who they were actually dealing with. The gap between the steady, unquestioning man she had been certain she knew and the man sitting across from her now, calm as a foundation, who had seen every single thing clearly and had said nothing and had moved with perfect purpose. Michael had prepared one thing to say. He had written it on a notepad 2 nights ago, looked at it, and then set it aside to settle. He wanted it to be something he simply knew rather than something he was recalling. Now he looked back at Simone, directly, quietly, without any excess of emotion in any direction. I gave 13 years to this with everything I had, he said. His voice was level, entirely his own. And when I found out what was happening underneath it, I didn't run and I didn't break. I just made sure I understood the whole shape of it first. I needed you to know that. The man you were certain you had completely figured out is the same man who didn't miss a single step. He buttoned his jacket. He stood. He walked to the door and down the hall and through the glass doors and out into the October morning, which was sharp and clear and smelled like the city and the season combined. And he stood on the sidewalk for one full moment, just breathing, feeling the particular quality of air that exists on the other side of setting something very heavy down after carrying it for a long time. Then he walked to his truck and drove back to work. There was still a full afternoon ahead of him, and he intended to use every hour of it. The diner Michael chose for this meeting was on Donald Lee Hollowell Parkway, the kind of establishment that had been exactly what it was for 30 years and had no interest in being anything else. Vinyl booths in dark red, ceiling fans that ran regardless of season, coffee kept hot and refilled without ceremony. The eggs were better than they had any right to be. Michael arrived at 7 and ordered coffee and did not look at his phone. He sat with both hands around the mug and looked out the window at the morning street. Garrison Wells arrived at 7:13. He was tall in the way his photographs had suggested, with the kind of physical presence that had probably served him well in rooms where presence was the first currency. He wore a slim-cut navy suit, the collar of his dress shirt open, shoes that communicated their cost without spelling it out. He moved through the diner with the slight visible recalibration of a man whose environments usually did more to confirm him than this one did. He slid into the booth across from Michael and said, "This is an interesting choice of venue," with the tone of a man who had decided to establish a small advantage before anything more substantive was said. Michael looked at him, took a moment, not as a power move, but as an honest act of taking measure. "I'm not here to threaten you," Michael said. "I'm not here to get into anything with you. I have one thing to say to your face and one thing to give you, and after that the rest of your morning is yours." Garrison settled back against the booth. "Go ahead. You knew she was married," Michael said. "You knew specifically about me because she told you about me. I know that because you walked up to me at a charity gala, shook my hand, looked me in the eye, and introduced yourself like a man who was meeting a stranger. That wasn't ignorance. That was a choice." He paused. "Every Tuesday, every Thursday, every hotel room, every time you answered that call or returned that text. Those were choices. I am not here to argue about them or to ask you to explain them. What I am here to tell you is that a man who walks through another person's life as though the rules of common decency have an exception clause for him is a man who has built everything he has on the assumption that no one is watching closely enough to notice. Michael looked at him steadily across the table. I noticed everything. I want you to have that. He slid the folder across the table. Garrison looked at it, but did not immediately reach for it. Open it, Michael said. The folder contained 14 pages. The first 8 were a documented record of communications between Garrison Wells and a junior account manager at his company named Brianna Faust. Over an 8-month period, Garrison had taken direct credit for 3 separate campaign concepts that Brianna had originated, developed, and presented in internal planning sessions, presenting them as his own original work to senior leadership and clients. When Brianna had raised the issue formally through the company's HR process, Garrison had conducted what the documentation described, with corroborating statements from 3 colleagues, as a systematic and formal campaign to undermine her professional credibility within the team. Brianna had resigned 4 months later, citing a hostile professional environment. She had kept everything. Every email thread, every Slack exchange, every original dated file with its unaltered metadata. She had also, it turned out, saved a recorded voicemail from Garrison that contained language about her complaint that no employment attorney would have any difficulty characterizing. Brianna had found Terrence's consulting firm through a professional misconduct advocacy forum. She had been holding the material for 7 months, certain of its contents and uncertain of the right moment and the right support structure for using it. Terrence had connected with her, reviewed what she had, and recognized immediately what it was and what it was for. The final 6 pages were a formal complaint filed with the company's parent corporation's Ethics and Conduct Board, and a parallel submission to the Industry Association's Professional Standards Committee. 2 signatures at the bottom. Brianna Faust as the primary complainant. Michael Calloway as a corroborating witness to Garrison's demonstrated pattern of conduct. Both filings had been submitted at 7:45 that morning, 30 minutes before this meeting began. Garrison read the pages in the particular progressive silence of a man watching something he had built. In this case, the careful architecture of a professional life constructed on other people's work and other people's tolerance begin to come apart under its own weight. His expression did not collapse at once. It changed in degrees, each one visible, the way a structure sounds before it falls. These were filed this morning, Michael said quietly, before you walked in here. Before I said a word to you. I am telling you the timeline because I want you to understand clearly that this is not a threat or a negotiation. It is already done. He let that sit. Brianna filed because she was ready, because she had been carrying it long enough. I signed on because what she went through at your hands and what you helped do to my marriage have the same source in you. The part that has decided other people's work and other people's lives exist for your convenience. Garrison's voice came back thinner than it had arrived. You have no idea what you've set in motion. I know exactly what I've set in motion, Michael said. And so does your director of operations. He received a courtesy copy at 7:30 this morning. The silence that followed was absolute. The ceiling fan turned. A waitress refilled coffee at the next table. The street outside the window continued with its business, entirely unbothered. I don't hate you, Michael said. The simplicity of it was genuine. I am not carrying that. I don't have the space for it, and it wouldn't serve anything I care about. What I did come here to give you was the truth about what happened here, because I think the version of it you've been carrying has some incorrect assumptions in it about who you were dealing with. He straightened and picked up his coffee mug for the last time. You looked at a man who worked with his hands and showed up steady every day and made a private decision that he was someone who could be moved through without consequence. I just needed you to know, before this morning gets any older, that the man you dismissed is the same man who closed your chapter on a Thursday morning before he went to work. He set the mug down. He left exact bills on the table, the cost of the coffee plus a full tip because the waitress had been attentive and that had nothing to do with any of the rest of this. He stood. He put on his jacket. He walked out of the diner without looking back at the booth and stepped into the morning, which was fully arrived now, the sun up and the street moving, and drove to the Moorfield site where his crew was waiting and the day's first pour was scheduled for 9. The divorce finalized in August, handled entirely through attorneys once both parties understood the full scope of what Patricia Holt had built across those 8 weeks. The documentation was comprehensive, The legal structure around Calloway and Reed was fully protected, and the court's final calculation reflected the complete picture, including the $19,400 in withdrawn marital funds, which George's equitable distribution framework treated as dissipation of marital assets and factored explicitly into Simone's settlement share. She received considerably less than Renata Chambers had projected in January. Garrison Wells was placed on administrative suspension by his company's ethics board in October, 12 days after Michael's meeting with him at the diner, pending a full investigation of Brianna Faust's complaint. The industry association's parallel review concluded in December. He separated from the company by mutual agreement in January, retaining separate legal counsel and, within 2 months, declining to return Simone's calls. Brianna Faust, for her part, had accepted a senior creative director role at a competing firm 3 weeks before the ethics board completed its preliminary findings. She sent Michael a brief message. "Thank you for standing beside me in this. It meant more than I can say." Michael replied, "You stood for yourself long before I arrived. I was just glad to be useful." Michael sold the house on Birchwood Lane in September to a young couple who walked through it twice and made an offer the same day. He bought a smaller house in East Point, 12 minutes from Vivian, with 4 good rooms, a wide backyard, and a garage he spent 3 October weekends converting into a combined workshop and home office. He did the work himself, which was not the fastest way, but was the way that mattered to him. He installed the lighting himself, ran the outlets himself, built the shelving unit along the east wall from lumber he selected and cut at the supply yard on a Saturday morning while Vivian was at church. He painted the living room on a Sunday in November. He opened all the windows even though it was cool, put his Spotify playlist through a Bluetooth speaker set on the drop cloth, and spent 4 hours working through the walls in the particular unhurried focus of a man who has arrived at a place that is entirely and only his. Derek Reed came by that evening with jerk chicken and rice from the Caribbean spot on Cascade Road and 2 bottles of ginger beer, and they sat on the drop cloth-covered floor of the still damp-smelling living room and talked the way old friends talk, when neither of them needs to perform anything for the other. They talked about the business, about Devontae's first semester, about the new crew members Michael had brought on, about a road trip they had been discussing for 3 years and had never taken and that Derek now proposed, with sudden and reasonable urgency, that they actually scheduled before another year dissolved. "Spring," Michael said, after the Moorfield completion. "Spring," Derek agreed. Calloway and Reed hired 3 additional crew members in October, bringing the total to 20. In November, Michael signed the lease on the Smyrna office space, the second location, the expansion he had been building toward for 2 years, and that the legal protection around the business had made possible to pursue cleanly and without encumbrance. He signed the papers on a Tuesday morning, shook hands with the property manager, and drove to the site to tell Deshawn and Calvin before anyone else. Deshawn's reaction was a slow nod, and the particular expression of a man absorbing good news he had been expecting for longer than he had said. Calvin immediately began making suggestions about the layout of the new site office space that were practical and good, and that Michael wrote down in his notebook on the spot. The social circle that Simone had worked carefully across those months remained, almost entirely, in Michael's corner. The Reeds, the Holloways, the Parishes. These were people who had known Michael Calloway in the years before Simone's narrative reached their ears, and they had seen, across those years, the specific, unadvertised ways in which he showed up. The quiet donation when the Holloway's son had a medical crisis. The weekend he had spent helping the Parishes move without being asked. The steady, unglamorous texture of a man who remembered what you told him and brought it back at the right moment with no fanfare. The narrative Simone had planted found no lasting purchase in soil that already knew him that well. The social circle recalibrated, naturally and without drama, the way genuine communities do when the facts become clear. On a Thursday morning in December, Michael pulled out of the new driveway for the first time in the early dark. The East Point neighborhood was quiet at this hour, the street lights still on, the cold sharp through the cracked window. He kept open regardless of season, because he had always preferred moving air to sealed comfort. Coffee in the cup holder, tool belt on the back seat, site drawings on the passenger seat for the Moorfield final inspection. His phone buzzed. Motion alert from the house camera he had installed the previous week. A straightforward setup, monitoring the front entry and the living room, the kind of basic security measure that made practical sense in a new home he was still getting to know. He glanced at the screen. 6:49 in the morning. In the living room of his new house, a gray tabby named Duke, who had been Simone's cat originally, who had transferred his loyalty to Michael with the unhurried certainty of an animal that understands things about people that people sometimes miss about themselves, was making his way across the living room floor in the early light. He stepped over the edge of the drop cloth Michael had not yet put away from the weekend's painting, picked his way to the wedge of light coming through the front window, turned one deliberate circle, and sat down. Settled. Certain. Entirely at home. Michael watched the clip to the end. He set the phone face up in the cup holder and pulled out of the driveway and drove toward the Moorfield site, where his crew would be arriving in 40 minutes, where there was real and substantial work waiting for him, the kind that became permanent when you did it with your full attention and your full integrity. The December morning opened ahead of him as he moved through the still streets, wide and cold and clear in the way of mornings that have no interest in pretending to be something softer than what they are. Just the road and the city and the work ahead, and a man who knew exactly where he was going. He was not the same man who had stood in that office doorway in March, listening to his life reveal itself in 4 minutes and 33 seconds. He was not lesser than that man. He was not more broken. He was more precisely himself, refined by the weight of what he had carried and the clarity of how he had chosen to carry it. More certain of what he valued, more honest about what he had built and what he intended to build from here. The December air came through the window. The coffee was exactly the right temperature. The road was open ahead of him, and the morning was fully his. He drove toward the work. He understood with quiet and complete conviction exactly where he was supposed to be. If this one moved you, share it with someone who needed to hear it today. Like the video, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next, because the next story is the one you won't be able to stop thinking about.